So here we're going to start with section 1.1, answering the question, what is or are statistics? Statistics can be used in kind of two different contexts here, either as singular, referring to the overall science of collecting, organizing, and interpreting data, or in the plural, actually referring to the data, the numbers or other pieces of information that describes or summarizes something. So let's talk about an example. So we talk about statistical studies, and this is one where, according to Nielsen Media Research, 111.9 million Americans turned in to watch Super Bowl 50. So they came up with this number, but how do you think they came up to this conclusion? Do you think they actually had to survey that many people in order to know for sure that they actually watched Super Bowl 50? So the question that they set out to answer with this statistical study is, what part of the population, which we're going to refer to here as all Americans, who are watching the game? Now, that word population can refer to different groups, but this study specifically was looking at all Americans. And so in statistics, the number of people watching the game, so out of the population, how many were actually watching the game, is what's called the population parameter. And so that's going to refer to the specific number we're trying to figure out, or they were trying to figure out here, in this case, Nielsen Media Research, for that particular statistical study. So in general, the population in a statistical study is the complete set of people or things being studied. So for example, it could refer to all Americans or all eligible voters. Whatever set that we're trying to study is referred to as the population. And so it can vary depending on what we're trying to study. Where the population parameter are the specific numbers describing characteristics of the population. So for instance, the number of Americans watching the Super Bowl would refer to as a population parameter, or the number of voters for a specific candidate out of the number of all eligible voters would be called a population parameter. So for each of the following situations, we're going to talk about and describe the population being studied and identify some of the population parameters that would be of interest in these cases. So first, let's talk about this one here that says Farmers Insurance wants to determine the average or mean amount paid to accident victims in car accidents without side impact airbags. So the population in this case would be the accident victims that were in car crashes without side impact airbags. And so we talk about that group as the population that's being studied, and what we're trying to determine about that population is the average amount paid. And that average amount paid would be what we call the population parameter, because it refers to the statistic that was determined on the population. We talk about this other one here in part B that says McDonald's wants to determine the weight of the potatoes delivered each week for making French fries. Now, the population here is not referring to people, but other things. What's being studied in this case would be the potatoes. So the population of the statistical study would be the potatoes that were delivered each week. The population parameter that's determined about the population is the average weight of the potatoes, or different numbers that we can determine about them. So one of those being their weight, how they vary, different things like that would be what we call population parameters. And then down here it says researching whether a new treatment would be effective against childhood leukemia. So the population of something for this kind of statistical study would be the group of children who have leukemia. So that would be the population that would be studied. And some parameters, some population parameters that can be determined are things like the percentage of children who recover with or without the treatment. So that's probably the primary population parameter to be determined about the population here. To go back to the Nielsen survey, rather than going out and surveying all Americans, the whole population that was under consideration, they simply took a much smaller sample of Americans, in this case 5,000 individuals. And when they did this, they recorded the raw data that was given from each of these individuals they surveyed, such as when and how long the TV was on, what show it was turned to, and who in the household was watching. With the raw data, they came up with what's called sample statistics. So the sample statistics are like the percentage of viewers in the sample who are watching individual shows. So what percentage were watching the Super Bowl, what percentage were watching something different. Also, we have the total number in the sample who watched the Super Bowl. So the raw data is what we start with after recording the information from the population, and from that we create what we call statistics about the sample, called sample statistics. And so in general, we say that a sample is a subset of the population from which the data are actually obtained. The actual measurements or observations collected from the sample constitute the raw data. And the sample statistics are the numbers describing the characteristics of the sample, which are found by consolidating or summarizing the raw data. So the key thing here is the sample statistic are what we like to use to estimate the population parameters. So if there's something we want to know about the population, we take a sample, we create the sample statistics, and try to see how well we think they match up or correspond to the population parameters. And here's another example. It says the U.S. Labor Department defines the civilian labor force as all those people who are either employed or actively seeking employment. And so each month, the Labor Department reports the unemployment rate, which is the percentage of people actively seeking employment within the civilian labor force. To determine the unemployment rate, the Labor Department surveys 60,000 households. And so what are the following for this statistical report? So starting out with the population. The population will be the group that the Labor Department wants to learn about, which is all the people who are in the civilian labor force. So the civilian labor force is the population under consideration here. The sample is consisting of the 60,000 households which are surveyed. The raw data is going to consist of all the information collected in the survey. And from there, they create the sample statistics, which summarize the raw data for the sample. So in this case, the most relevant sample statistic is the percentage of people in the sample who are actively seeking employment. The population parameter is the characteristics of the entire population that correspond to the sample statistic. So in other words, the sample statistic is what we get from the sample, and the population parameter would be the same kind of number but what we would get if we check the whole population rather than just a smaller group in the sample. But we take the sample statistic and make an inference about it to the population parameter. But we're not actually directly measuring the population parameter because that would require us to go out to the entire population under consideration here to survey rather than just a smaller group. But we're going to use the sample statistics in many cases as an estimator of the population parameter. So let's talk about some numbers they got from their study about the Super Bowl. Suppose that they found 31% in their sample of 5,000 Americans actually watched the Super Bowl. What do we call this number, and what does it tell us about the population? This number is called the sample statistic again. And so based off of this, it gives us a starting point to determine the population parameter, which would be the percentage of all American households watching the Super Bowl. What we'd like to do is to take that 31% that we find as a sample statistic and apply it to the entire population and use it as an estimator of that. So how much would that represent? Assuming the population of America is 325 people. And how do we know if it would actually be accurate or not? Well, 31% of 325 million is about 100.8 million. So that would be what we would call the population parameter in this case, but we're taking it from the sample statistic that was determined. So we would like to know if a sample statistic is really a good estimator of the population parameter or not. So a starting point for this is something called margin of error. Basically, how far off is the sample statistic from the genuine population parameter? So the margin of error is the range of values likely to contain the population parameter. We find this by taking the sample statistic and subtracting away or adding to it the margin of error value. So sample statistic, we subtract margin of error, sample statistic, add margin of error. And what we get is something called the confidence interval. And the confidence interval means that we're 95% confident that the true population parameter falls between these two numbers within this range. So this means we can say with 95% confidence the population parameter is within the confidence interval. The Nielsen Super Bowl study had a margin of error of 1%. And so we can determine the confidence interval from here by minus 1% and add 1% to 31%. We subtract 1 away, we get 30%. If we add 1, we get 32%. And so we call the confidence interval is the range of 30% to 32%. And the margin of error, again, is defined so that we have 95% confidence that the population parameter falls within this range. Another way of looking at it is to say that we expect it to happen 19 out of 20 repeated studies. So the great majority of the time, the population parameter will be contained within the confidence interval. Here's another example. It says the Pew Research Center for People in the Press interviewed 1,546 adult Americans about their attitudes towards the future. Asked whether humans would land on Mars within the next 50 years, 76% of the 1,546 people said either definitely yes or probably yes. And they found out that the margin of error for the poll was 3 percentage points. So what we're going to do is Describe the population and the sample for the survey and explain the meaning of the sample statistic. So the population that they sampled the 1,546 people from are all adult Americans. So specifically who they're trying to find out more about are adult Americans specifically. So that's our population for the study. And so using the sample statistic of 76% and the margin of error of 3 percentage points, we subtract 3 away from 76, we get 73. We add 3 to 76, and we get 79. And so with 95% confidence, the population parameter should fall between these two numbers. And we call that the confidence interval from 73% to 79%. So what we can conclude from this is that a large percentage of all adult Americans think that humans will definitely or probably land on Mars within the next 50 years. And we can go a little further with this survey as well. It says the same Pew survey also asked people whether they believed humans would be cloned within the next 50 years. And so on this one, 51% answered either definitely yes or probably yes. And the margin of error was still 3 percentage points. And so the question is, can we be confident that a majority of adult Americans think that humans will be cloned within the next 50 years? If we take our margin of error and subtract it from 51 and add it to 51%, the range of numbers for the confidence interval will go from 48% to 54%. So what that tells us is the population parameter, that is the percentage for all adult Americans, might actually fall below 50% because it can range between these two numbers. And so in this case, we cannot be fully confident that a majority, greater than 50%, would agree with this question. And so overall, these are the basic steps that are taken with any statistical study. The first step is to state the goal of your study very precisely. That is, determine the population you want to study and exactly what you'd like to learn about it. For instance, with the Super Bowl, we wanted to know about all adult Americans specifically. And what we want to learn about them was how many of them were watching the Super Bowl. And then step 2 is a very important step we'll talk more about as we go along, and that's choosing a sample which is representative of the population. We want our sample to closely mirror what the population looks like as a whole. And then step 3, once we have that taken care of, we can collect data from the sample and summarize this data by finding sample statistics that are of interest. And then for step 4, we'll use the sample statistics to make inferences about the population, specifically what we call the population parameter. And then step 5, we'll draw conclusions and determine what we've learned and whether or not we achieved the goal that we set out for doing in this statistical study. And so let's go through the example of how the 5 basic steps were applied from the previous example, where we're talking about the survey of landing on Mars. So the first step was identify the goals. The goal was learning about specific attitudes of Americans toward the future. They chose just adult Americans as their population, deliberately leaving out children. And so they chose 1,546 for their sample. And although we're not told how the sample was drawn, for now we're going to assume that they selected these 1,546 adult Americans in a way that they would be typical of the entire adult population. And so from there, they collected raw data by asking carefully chosen questions of the people in the sample. The raw data are the individual responses to the questions. They summarized this data with sample statistics such as the overall percentages of people in the sample who answered yes or no to each question. And then for step 4, they used techniques of statistical science to allow them to infer population characteristics. In this case, the inferences consisted of estimating certain population parameters and calculating the margin of error. And so to summarize this section, we'll start off with the population in a statistical study is the complete set of people or things being studied. For instance, all adult Americans. The population parameters are specific numbers describing the characteristics of the population. For instance, how many adult Americans watched the Super Bowl? A sample is a smaller subset of the population from which the data are actually obtained. And we do a sample since it's more than likely always impossible to survey every thing or object or person in the population. The actual measurements or observations collected from the sample are what we call the raw data, and the sample statistics are the numbers describing the characteristics of the sample found by consolidating or summarizing the raw data. For instance, one sample statistic was the percentage of those who watched the Super Bowl in that sample. The margin of error in a statistical study is used to describe the range of values or confidence interval likely to contain the population parameter. For instance, 32% with a margin of error of 4 would give us a confidence interval of 28% to 36%. Subtract the 4 to get 28, add the 4 to get 36. And so here's a practice example that you could pause the video and I'll put the answers to it here up in just a second. It says a study of 3,005 adults aged 57 to 85 showed that 85% of them use at least one prescription drug, and the margin of error is 2%. Identify the goal of the study, the population parameter, the raw data, the sample statistic, and the confidence interval. If you'd like to try this on your own, just pause the video, and in a second I'll go through what each of these are. So the goal of the study was to determine how many adults aged 57 to 85 used at least one prescription drug. You might word it slightly different, but that's the basic idea here. The population are adults aged 57 to 85. Those are the group that they wanted to know about. The population parameter is the percentage of those adults in the population aged 57 to 85 who used at least one prescription drug. The raw data is the individual responses to the survey. The sample are the 3,005 adults aged 57 to 85 that they surveyed. We know the sample statistic, it's the 85% of the sample that responded yes to the survey. And then the confidence interval, if we take the 85% and subtract 2 and add 2, we get 83 to 87%.